So good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the Torah class. Tonight's Torah portion is the Torah portion of Vaera. Vaera is God speaking to Moses, begins with God speaking to Moses, and God says, I have revealed myself to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to your ancestors, and he continues to have this conversation with Moshe, and the majority of the Torah portion comprises of 7 of the 10 plagues. And just to recap, at this point, the Jewish people are in Egypt. They are enslaved to Pharaoh. They were there for almost 210 years at this point, and God called to Moses from the burning bush during last week's Torah portion and told him that you are to go down south to Egypt and go to Pharaoh and tell him, let my people go. And he does just that. And initially, it seems to stir up more problems than it does solutions. And then things start taking a turn for the good when the plagues start hitting the Egyptians fast and furious. The plagues take about a year to be carried out, all 10 plagues. And finally, in next week's Torah portion, as we shall see, the Jewish people are released and freed from, redeemed from Egypt by God, led by Moses. And so what we're going to focus on tonight are the first 3 plagues. And just want to make a disclaimer or an introduction, firmly so that we don't speak politics here at Chabad, and so tonight's class is no different. The class was actually prepared in this curriculum, I believe about 4 or 5 months ago. And so if there are any takeaways that someone may take from it regarding the current politics, you shall just know that, how does a famous line go? The opinions are your own. And so definitely, we have to take the weekly Torah portion as lessons for everything that occurs in our life. But I'm definitely not giving any commentary on the current politics. I am giving commentary just on the weekly Torah portion. With that disclaimer, we'll jump right into it. They say, the famous saying, you know what the problem with sitting on the fence is? That after a while, it starts to hurt. We may be sitting on the fence about a lot of things. We have a lot of things that go on in our lives that, for some people and for angels, as Kabbalah explains to us, it's very simple. They don't have such a complex mind. There's not much complexity in their decisions. It's kind of laid out for them. And so decisions are easy and it goes smooth. We as human beings, we're blessed with a complex brain. We're capable. We're blessed with a complex brain. We're capable of intense examination before making a decision, but that capacity of examination, reflection, and analysis could actually make decision-making more difficult. And in modern times, this conundrum really this challenge has been compounded. We have a lot out there. The world is very large, but really it has become very small because it's all within reach. And if we weren't shackled down by certain red lines in our lives, we'd be free to do everything and anything. Which leads us to the question about decision making and about these lines in the sand or red lines that we shall be making, or shall we be making? Do we always have to make red lines? What are the red lines that we shall be making? And does Torah give us any insight into how or really when to make these red lines and how to implement them throughout our lives? And that's what we're going to focus on this class, gleaning from this week's Torah portion. We're going to begin with the first 3 plagues. The first plague that God brought on the Egyptians was the plague of blood, where the Nile, which at that time was actually the deity of the Egyptians, the Nile was transformed into blood. Following that, Pharaoh called to Moses and said, please pray to God that the Nile should return to its regular water. And Moses did so, and the blood disappeared. The Nile returned to its natural state. Following that, once again, Pharaoh refused to allow the Jewish people to go, and Moses lifted his staff, or Aaron took the staff and hit the water, and out of the water came the frogs, Sfardiim. Fardea is the singular for frogs in Hebrew. And the frogs came, they went everywhere. They went in the houses, and they went in the clothes, and they went in the closets, and they went in the ovens, and they went in every single, the doughs. The frogs were all over the place. And finally, Moses was called to Pharaoh's palace, and Pharaoh said, look, Moses, let the Jewish people go. I'm going to let them go. Just please pray to God to remove the frogs. And he did so. And once again, Pharaoh refused to redeem the Jewish people. Then came the third plague, which was lice. There was lice all over the place. Once again, he called for Moses. Moses came, prayed to God. Lice was removed, and Pharaoh once again refused to allow the Jewish people to come to be redeemed. And then came the fourth plague. The fourth plague was a unique plague. The fourth plague was the wild animal, where these wild animals came and just rampaged throughout the entire Egypt. And that's where we'll begin quoting that verse in this week's Torah portion, discussing the wild animals, where we're going to notice a nuanced difference between that verse and the other verses pertaining to the first three plagues. There we go. Once again, for some reason, it is not working. Not sure why it does that. There we go. Okay. So, chapter 8, verse 18, this week's Torah portion. And I will separate on that day, when it comes to the plague of Arev, which is the wild animals, God says, and I will separate on that day the land of Goshen, upon which my people stand. There will be no mixture of noxious creatures there, in order that you know that I am God in the midst of the earth. What is this verse referring to? And it says, and I will separate on that day of the land of Goshen. Goshen was, I guess you can say, was a province, or may it be a village or a city. That's where the Jewish people were situated, in that province of Goshen. Goshen didn't take up a large swath of the land of Egypt, and that's where the Jewish people were. And so God's saying that these wild animals is coming as a punishment, as a plague for the Egyptians and the Egyptians only. And so the wild animals will go only throughout Egypt, but not in Goshen, where the Jewish people are. And what is the purpose of this separation? In order that you know that I am God in the midst of the earth. Now, if we notice, this is the first time, this is the fourth plague, but it's the first time that God is making the separation, that this verse tells us of this separation. What happened with the first three plagues? Did they affect the Jewish people? Did the Jewish people have blood, or did they have water? Were the frogs all over the Jewish people as well? How about the kinnim, the lice? If this is the first time it's mentioning this separation. Now, it's a matter of debate, as is everything, right? Two Jews, three opinions. They say that there was once a shipwreck, and they arrived on this island 20 years after this shipwreck, and they see this Jew there who's there on the island alone, and they see two big structures. And they say, Chaim, what are these two structures about? And he says, well, this structure over here on the right, that's my synagogue where I go to pray. And they say, so what's this other structure? He says, oh, that's the synagogue that I don't pray at. So two Jews, three opinions. And when it comes to this discussion about what happened with the first three plagues, the sages have a debate. The medieval sages have this discussion about the separation of the Jewish people. Was it always, or did it actually just begin now at the fourth plague? And so we begin with the Ibn Ezra. The Ibn Ezra, Rabbi Avram Ibn Ezra, was a famous sage from the 12th century, and he comments as follows. And they dug. That is a quote from the verse of the first plague, the plague of blood, and it says that they dug looking for fresh water. And he comments as follows. Many have said that water that was red like blood when in the hand of an Egyptian became clear in the hand of a Hebrew. If that is so, why is this miracle not recorded in the Torah? In other words, according to some of the opinions that he had heard on that point, there were some sages that he's quoting that said that indeed the miracle was that the blood was only for the Egyptians. Whereas for the Hebrews, for the Jewish people, it remained water. Not only that, if an Egyptian drew a cup of water and it was blood, when he handed it to the Jew, it then miraculously transformed into water. So the Ibn Ezra asks, if such a great miracle, why isn't it recorded in the Torah? In my view, he continues, following from the simple meaning of the scriptures, the plagues of blood, frogs, and lice included the Egyptians and the Hebrews. These three plagues did not cause much harm. Only for the plague of the wild animals, which was more destructive, and subsequent plagues did God distinguish between the Egyptians and Israel. And as mentioned, this aforementioned verse, verse 18 in chapter 8, is actually a proof of Ibn Ezra's statements from this verse, where seemingly only at the fourth plague mentions this difference between the Egyptians and the Jews, seems to imply that the first three plagues did not have any separation between the Jews and the Egyptians. So in other words, I guess contrary to the belief of many of us, there are actually some of the commentaries, and here Ibn Ezra is the most prominent among them, that mentions that the first three plagues affected the Jewish people as much as it did the Egyptians. But he's of the minority. The majority of the opinion, and we'll have sampling opinion here from some of the other sages, disagree with Ibn Ezra's opinion, and as we shall soon see, some of them very harshly so. Here we have Rabbeinu Bachye, who is a 13th century sage, and he comments as follows: and I will separate on that day, quoting our verse here at the fourth plague, and as much as the first plagues were relatively stationary, it was unremarkable that they occurred in the central part of Egypt and not in Goshen, where the Jews lived. By contrast, wild animals wreak havoc everywhere. When these beasts came on God's command from the desert to destroy everything, it's only natural that they would reach Goshen as well, since it was also part of the land of Egypt. The Jews were only spared because of the miracle from God. He explains as follows. He explains that the only reason why it's mentioned here at the fourth plague is not because it didn't happen. The separation didn't happen at the first three plagues. It did. It happened. But it wasn't remarkable. It wasn't noticeable by everyone. Because the fact that some water turns to blood and some doesn't, the fact that there's a power outage, we have those here in Los Angeles occasionally, the fact that there's a power outage in one location and not in the other. Similar to that, he's explaining that that's the way it is with the blood, with the frogs, and with the lice. Right? In some houses you have mice, in other houses you don't. In some houses you have termites, mice in New York. In some houses you have termites, in other houses you don't. It's not so shocking, it's not so noticeable, it's not remarkable when it would have that separation. So indeed there was that separation, but it wasn't noticeable. When it came to the wild animals, on the other hand, that's when it was the stark contrast between the Jewish location and the rest of Egypt. Because here, these wild animals, they roam freely, they move around fast, right? A cheetah goes quite fast. Many animals can run really fast. And they were there for a week's time. And in a week's time, they still didn't make it to Goshen. It was clear, it was remarkable. The contrast was as clear as day that they were avoiding the Jewish area. They were not reaching Goshen. And at that point, at the fourth plague, is when everyone noticed that there was this clear distinction between the Jewish area and the non-Jewish area. So Rabbeinu Bechaye explains. That's why it's mentioned at the fourth plague. The Radbaz, who is also a later century, a 16th century, a later sage, a 16th century sage, Rabbi David Ibn Zimra, which is why he's called Radbaz. It's the Hebrew acronym of his name. He mentions as follows in his responsa. And he gets a little bit harsh with the Ibn Ezra's commentary. Rabbi Avram Ibn Ezra writes that Egypt and Israel were both subject to the plagues of blood, frogs, and lice. It's forbidden to believe such a thing, especially since scripture itself indicates the opposite. And he quotes a verse from the plague of blood. And Egypt could not drink water from the river. And the second verse there, all of Egypt dug around the river. The implication being that the Israelites did not need to do this, since they were drinking from the river's waters. Here, Egypt doesn't mean the country, it means the people of Egypt, in other words, excluding the Jewish people, which is clearly implying from this verse that the Israelites did not need to do this because they had fresh water. And so it is said, the Radbaz continues, when Moses warned of the frogs, that they will come up into you, he tells Pharaoh, and into your people, Pharaoh's people. And then later that they will depart from you, Pharaoh, and from your houses, the Egyptians, and from your servants and from your. Implied is that they were not in Israel. The same is true of the lice. From where it is clear, we can infer to where it is not clear. And so he finishes off, I fail to understand. If the plague was also on Israel, then what proof did it hold for Pharaoh that he should send the Israelites from his land? I shouldn't have bothered wasting ink on this sort of thing, but I did not want to give any space to those who speak falsely regarding the words of our sages. And so the Radbaz here has two distinct arguments. The first one is against the Ibn Ezra's opinion, is the verse aren't that clear. Yes, you have a verse by the fourth plague, which seems to imply that that's when the separation, the distinction between the Jews and the non-Jews was made. But the other verses of plagues 1, 2, and 3 seem to imply the exact opposite, that the distinction between the Jews and Egyptians happened even then. And then he has an argument, just a rational argument. And he says, what was the purpose of the plagues? The purpose of the plagues was to prove to the Egyptians that what they're doing is wrong and that the Egyptians should send the Jewish people. But hold on, if the Jews were receiving the plagues just like the Egyptians, what type of proof is that? Pharaoh will say, prove to me that I should let the Jews go. Look, they're getting the plagues just like I am. So it's not proving anything to me. And so, yeah, he uses some harsh terms, but he poses some good questions, some valid questions, which is why the majority of opinions hold like he does, and that is against Ibn Ezra's opinion that the first three plagues were indeed, the Ibn Ezra says that they were indeed afflicted the Jewish people just as the non-Jews, and it wasn't such terrible plagues, whereas from the fourth plague on, there was that distinction. The majority of opinions do not follow that. So the three questions that we had, the two questions that the Radbaz posed on the Ibn Ezra have interesting answers that we can give. The first one is that the Ibn Ezra can explain that the reason why the verse in plague 1 and 2 mention the effect it has on the Egyptians is not because it was only the Egyptians that were affected, but rather it's only the Egyptians that were affected that matters to the narrative of the story. In other words, in Pharaoh's discussion with Moses, the only matter is how it affected the Egyptians and how terrible it affected the Egyptians. It doesn't matter how it affected the Jews or not. It's not such a powerful answer, but it's an answer that you may suggest. And an answer for the second question is a little harder to explain, which is, if it's meant for Pharaoh and it's a proof for Pharaoh to let the Jewish people go, then why would it happen to the Jews as well? Which leads us to a third and more powerful question, perhaps the most powerful of them all on the Ibn Ezra's opinion, is why would God let the Jews be afflicted by any of the plagues? Let's not discuss, did it happen, did it not happen? Why would that happen? Why would God have the Jews be affected by the plagues? Wasn't this only for the Egyptians? And so, yes, Ibn Ezra's opinion isn't the accepted opinion, but nonetheless, it's still part of Torah, and there's still tremendous lessons to be derived from his opinion. And so we're going to discuss his opinion, and we're going to try to get to the bottom of it, and from this, we will derive important lessons in our day-to-day lives. And so to understand this, primarily the main question of why would God allow this to happen to the Jewish people, and with that we will understand the other ones, the other questions, we're going to get to the core issue, to the core aspect of the plagues, namely, what was the reason behind the plagues? Why? Why did God bring 10 plagues upon the Egyptians? So there's the first, where are we? There we go. So there's an interesting, I don't know why this is not in order, but there we go. Okay, so there's an interesting statement from the Baal Shem Tov, which gives a deeper spin, if you will, to the 10 plagues, which is a good introduction to understand the simple understanding of why God brought the plagues, which obviously the main reason that we all know was to punish the Egyptians. They've enslaved the Jewish people for that many years. God's going to punish them. But there are a number of other reasons that the verse actually mentions, and we'll get to them momentarily. But before that, as by way of introduction, the Baal Shem Tov explains something powerful, and that is that everything in life has the superficial understanding and the deeper meaning, the exoteric and the esoteric. And so the Baal Shem Tov explains that yes, according to the Ibn Ezra, even the first three plagues were even affected the Jewish people. But how did it affect the Jewish people? Did it affect the Jewish people as a plague, or was it somehow a blessing? And he explains, the Baal Shem Tov explains that really the plagues, all 10 of them, and we're not going to analyze all 10, we're going to highlight one as an example, but all 10 of them really could have been seen and received and perceived as a blessing were it brought upon those deserving blessings. And so, for example, the plague of blood, it was brought upon the Egyptians, and it was also brought upon the Jews, but because the Jews were not deserving of a plague, they were deserving of a blessing, it brought out its blessing aspect of that statement of blood. As well as with the second plague, frogs, and the third plague, and so on. And here's a quote from one of the Baal Shem Tov students, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polna. This is the first book that was printed of Hasidism. I don't recall the year it was printed, somewhere in the early mid-18th century. Either way, he writes as follows. I heard in the name of my teacher, the Baal Shem Tov, that the 10 plagues were directed at Pharaoh specifically, for Pharaoh is associated with forgetfulness of spirituality, which we'll get to momentarily, that Pharaoh claimed he did not know the existence of God. He denied the very existence of God. And so because Pharaoh is Kabbalistically associated with the concept of forgetfulness of spirituality, the plagues are directed at Pharaoh. How so? For example, the plague of Tzvardeya, the plague of frogs. The root word tzfar indicates light, as in the Aramaic for a bright morning, tzafra nahir. Deya, which is the second half of the word for frog, meaning knowledge, is the opposite of forgetfulness, which is called Pharaoh. Thus, it came as a plague to Pharaoh, but for Israel, it was tzfar deya. Understand this, and there is charm in the words of the wise. And he explains as follows. Take, for example, the plague of tzvardeya, of frogs. For Pharaoh, it was a devastating, for Pharaoh, literally, in Egypt, it was a devastating plague. It destroyed the crop, it ate the crop, it ruined food in the house, it ruined all different things, it made people sick, and so on and so forth. It was a devastating plague. But there's the spiritual root, the spiritual core of tzvardeya, the Hebrew word of frog. That same word is a composition of two words, tzfar, deya. Tzfar means bright, deya means knowledge. Pharaoh, spiritually speaking, is associated with a concept of forgetfulness. And so for Pharaoh being non-deserving of a blessing, being non-deserving of anything positive, it came to him as a plague. But for the Jewish people who received the tzvardeya, they didn't receive literal tzvardeya. They did not have literal frogs. They had this sudden burst of bright knowledge with regard to holiness and godliness. So tzvardeya descended upon Egypt. For the Egyptians deserving of negativity, deserving of punishment, they got literal tzvardeya, literal frogs. For the Jewish people, non-deserving of that punishment, they got the spiritual concept of tzvardeya, which was a blessing. Tzvardeya, shining, bright knowledge, divine knowledge, and so on with the rest of the books. So the Baal Shem Tov explains, which really can be a very powerful way of looking at anything in life. Are we to perceive it as something terrible, or can we look deeper into it and see a blessing? So now we're going to go into the technical aspect of what the reason is. Why did God bring about the plagues against the Egyptians? And as a matter of fact, there are 3 reasons mentioned in the Torah. Here's the first reason. In the book of Exodus, God tells Moses to tell Pharaoh, "For if you do not let my people go, behold, I will incite against you and against your servants and against your people and in your houses a mixture of noxious creatures, and the houses of Egypt will be filled with a mixture of noxious creatures, as well as the land upon which they are." In other words, the reason for the plagues is for if you do not let my people go. The reason for the plagues is to force the Egyptians to allow the Jewish people to go. That's the purpose of the plagues, to force the Egyptians to allow the Jewish people to go. Then there's a second reason. The reason that God tells Abraham, where does Abraham land in this picture? Years earlier, those who recall, we discussed it briefly, there was the covenant of the parts, where God makes a covenant with Abraham. And during that covenant, God tells Abraham that your descendants will be enslaved in a foreign land. They will be strangers in a foreign land. And then they will leave that foreign land with much riches. And that is a reference to the land of Egypt. But what does God say following that? God tells Abraham something specific. And God said to Abraham, "You shall surely know that your seed will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and they will enslave them and oppress them for 400 years. Here's the key. "And also the nation that they will serve will I judge, and afterward they will go forth with great possessions." Before your descendants will go forth with great possessions, says God, I will judge them. I will punish them. I will punish the Egyptians. So in other words, the plagues weren't just to force them to let the Jews go. There was actually a punitive function to the plagues, namely a punishment to the Egyptians for enslaving the Jews. Those are the 2 reasons. Then we have a third reason that we touched upon earlier. And the third reason is in this week's Torah portion as well. "So said God, with this you will know that I am the Lord. Behold, I will smite with the staff that is in my hand upon the water that is in the Nile, and it will turn to blood." So in other words, the third reason is to teach the Egyptians, to teach them to have an awareness of the one God. They were pagan idol worshippers. They served the Nile as their primary deity. They served the sheep. They served various other idols. But what was the purpose of the plagues? The plagues was to educate them that there's really only one. And that seems to be the deepest and most profound reason from all the 3. You see, because if we look at the 3 reasons, really they can teach us of 3 ways of dealing with negativity. The first way is the first reason, first purpose of the plagues, so that the Egyptians would free the Hebrews. In other words, if you have negativity in your life, try to render it powerless. Try to constrain it and force it to do what you want to do with it. Like God did to the Egyptians. God wanted the Egyptians to free the Jews, so he forced them, he coerced them into freeing the Jews. It didn't affect them per se. He just forced them to do what God wanted. Then we have the second reason, to punish the Egyptians. To punish the Egyptians on a personal level, when we have our inner Egypt, if you will, when we have our inner enemy, or we have an enemy from without, and we want to get rid of them, we want to make sure to stop what the enemy is doing to us, not only to constrain the bad, and not only to render it powerless, but actually destroy it. Destroy it. That's the punishment of the Egyptians. God was going to destroy the Egyptians. Destroy them to such a point where they won't do what they were doing up until now. But then you have the third and most powerful. To bring the Egyptians to an awareness of one God, to educate them, to transform the evil into something positive. Not to force them to doing what you want them to do, not to break them, but to educate them until they do what you want them to do. Because they recognize that that's the correct thing. When we have something evil, when you have something negative, not necessarily evil, negative in our lives, when we have talk about a personal character trait, which may be a negative character trait, we can try to subdue it, we can try to break it, or we can utilize it for the correct purpose. If we're passionate can be something which is bad, passionate can be something which is good. Don't destroy the passion. Channel it into the right direction. With little kids, they always say that they're always good. Kids are good, they're just sometimes misdirected. And as a parent, as an educator, our job is to constantly redirect them, to refocus where they should focus their energy. We all have that child within, we all have that energy misplaced, we all have that excitement and enthusiasm. It's not to break the enthusiasm, it's not to break the excitement, it's not to break the passion, it's not to break whatever character trait it may be, it's not to break it. The ultimate purpose is to transform it. That's this third reason of bringing the Egyptians to an awareness of the one God. How does that fit in with the Egyptians? That fits in with the Egyptians as follows. When you look at the plagues, each one of the plagues served a different purpose. You have 10 plagues in total. The 10 plagues are split into 3 categories. First 3, the middle 3, and then the final 4. The purpose of the first 3 was to bring about the general awareness of one God. That was the purpose of it. And that is why the first plague attacked the Nile. Right? They say, why was Pharaoh holding the Jews? Because he was in denial. Another joke, they say, along the same lines, they say that Sam's sister has twins, and she calls her big brother, and she says, Sam, I had twins. I'm looking for names. You know, we haven't really come to a decision what the names should be. What do you think I should name them? We have one boy, one girl. What do you think I should name the girl? Sam thinks for a moment, and he says, Denise. So his sister thinks, you know, Sam, that's actually a very nice name. Denise is a nice name. What do you think we should name the boy? He says, the boy you should name the nephew. So when it comes to being in denial, Pharaoh was in denial. The Egyptians were in denial. And how were they in denial? Specifically through the Nile. The Nile was their deity. And God said, you know what, I'm going to attack their deity first to prove that there is no worth in their deities. There is no such thing as idols. They're nonsense. And that's why the first plague was with the water, the Nile. The second plague was also with the Nile. The frogs came from the Nile, says Aaron took the stick and hit the Nile. Why? This exact purpose. As Rashi, our favorite commentary in this week's Torah portion, tells us, he struck their deity, then he struck them. First, he began with their deity. Then he struck them. The third plague as well, plague of lice. We find something interesting about the plague of lice. The verse tells us, following the plague of lice, so the necromancer said to Pharaoh, it is the finger of God. But Pharaoh's heart remained steadfast, and he did not hearken to them as God had spoken. Why did the necromancers, the magicians of that time, why suddenly by the third plague did they say this? It's the finger of God. We don't see that they said it by the first plague of blood. Moses goes, transforms the water of the Nile into blood, and what happens? Pharaoh says, you're bringing magic to the Mecca of magic? Really? We have specifically, it says necromancers because in Hebrew the word is chartumim, which are specifically those who use the dead for magic. So we have necromancers, we have magicians here in Egypt that can do anything. And lo and behold, the magicians came and they took some water, some debate where the water came from, but it was water nonetheless. And they magically transformed the water to blood. So Pharaoh said, you see, no big deal. The blood is not a big deal. You're bringing magic to the Mecca of magic. And so it was with the second plague. They also managed to bring frogs out of water, miraculously, seemingly through magic. Came the third plague, the plague of lice. And try as they might, the necromancers were not able to bring about lice from the dust of the earth. And why is that? Rashi explains, because the power of magic is limited to a specific size and greater than that size. Lice is too small to be affected by these powers. Only God has an effect over something so small. And so when it came to this third plague, the necromancer says, Pharaoh, this ain't magic. This is something much greater than that. This is the finger of God. And Pharaoh still refused to believe it. But what do we see from this third plague? That the third plague as well was a very crucial plague to prove to the Egyptians the very existence of God. And so the first three plagues were stressing and underlying this specific concept of the existence of God. Now we can get back to the Ibn Ezra. Now we can get back to the questions that we asked on the Ibn Ezra's opinion, namely that the first three plagues affected the Jewish people as well. You see, the purpose of the first three plagues was this exact idea: to demolish and demonstrate the folly of the Egyptian beliefs. And if so, the Jewish people did have to experience these plagues. Why is that? Old beliefs die hard. If we believe in something really strong, firmly, we believe in something, we're used to something, we're convinced about it, then even if people present us with arguments, valid arguments, factual arguments, it's not going to change us. It needs to be something which is irrefutable. It needs to be something which is grand. It needs to be something which is tremendous in order for us to change our belief, in order to us to change something that we're specifically connected to. I guess one example that comes to mind that was going on this past week, not political, is for those of you familiar, there's a social media chat called WhatsApp. And WhatsApp, some of you may use it, is it's used by I think billions, 400 million people around the world. It's used by the majority of India as their biggest market, but here in the United States, there are millions as well that use it. It's used by 400 million people around the world. And recently they updated their privacy concerns and their privacy rules, and they said that they're sharing more information with Facebook, the parent company. Not getting into if it's true, if it's beneficial or not, if it's true or not, or if it affects us that much. But immediately there was a call to change to the other two similar apps called Telegram or Signal. Those are the two other apps that are very similar. And there's heated debates back and forth by different people who utilize these three different messaging systems. But somehow with all these heated debates, nothing really changed. For the most part, people stayed on WhatsApp. Why? Because old beliefs die hard. If we're used to something, and we're used to doing it, and we're used to doing it for many, many years, it's going to take a lot more than just some sort of news article that's going to change our opinion. For our opinion to change, it has to be something monumental, something drastic. And so for God to explain and to express to the Egyptians this idea that there's only one God and there's no one else, it has to be an across-the-board statement. It has to be that there is no room for mistaking. What would have happened if God brought the blood and the blood was only in the Nile, the part that was next to the Egyptians, but the part of the Nile that was next to the Jews didn't transform to blood? You know what the Egyptians would say? Nah, you see, God's not so powerful. God's not really omnipotent. God's not really all powerful as they say he is, because look, our deity overpowered him. Part of the Nile stayed warm because our deity, the Nile, is still powerful. It wouldn't have done its purpose, the deepest purpose of teaching the Egyptians about the one and only. Same with the frogs. Had God brought frogs only upon the Egyptians and not upon the Jewish people, they would have said the same complaint. You see, our deity, the Nile, is powerful. He could combat God. It's doable because there's a part that didn't get affected. And the same with the lice. Same idea. If the lice didn't affect the Jewish people, it wouldn't have had the desired effect. The words of the Rebbe. Based on the above, we can understand. As Rashi explains, God brought the first two plagues to strike their deity. For this reason, the first two plagues had to also affect the Israelites' water. Inasmuch as their deity was being struck by the plagues had to be wherever their deity was to be found. If not, Pharaoh could have thought that this particular section of his deity, the part in the Hebrew territory of Goshen, was indeed greater than the Holy One, blessed be he, heaven forfend. So that answers the greatest question we had on the Ibn Ezra's opinion. How can you say that the plagues were brought on the Jewish people? You know why that God brought the plagues on the Jewish people? Because that's the only way for God that's the only way for the message to get across that these deities are really meaningless. There's nothing to them. There's nothing they can do. But this teaches us also, on a personal level, an important lesson. And a very important perspective. And that is that just as in order to prove God's oneness to the Egyptians, it had to be something which was consistent, which was clear, which was across the board, without a shred of doubt. So too, in our lives, there are certain times that we have to apply things unequivocally. There are certain times that we have to draw that red line, make a decision, and don't differentiate. What do I mean by that? In Jewish law, we have that concept. There are certain laws that were instituted by the sages in the times of the Talmud or earlier that were instituted for a specific reason, that had spiritual connotations to it as well, spiritual meaning as well. But seemingly they came for specific reasons, which would lead one to believe that if those reasons are no longer there, then the enactment from the sages should no longer apply. Nonetheless, according to Jewish law, if it was a specific type of enactment of decree from the sages, it still followed till today, and in all areas across the board unequivocally, because it's there for a purpose. And if it's there for a purpose, even if we don't know the purpose, if it seems to us that the reason is no longer existence, we still have to follow that edict from the sages. What's an example? One example can be, for those that we've been in synagogues, many of us haven't been in a synagogue in a while, but we have the repetition of the Amidah, where the cantor, after everyone completes the special blessings, the 18 blessings of the Amidah, everyone can sit down. Then the cantor goes ahead and says all the blessings once again. The repetition of the Amida, we all enter Amen, we stand for the Kedusha, we stand for the Modim, and so on. Why does he repeat the Amida? Why does the cantor repeat the Amida? The cantor repeats the Amida because back in the olden days, nowadays as well, but much more common in the olden days, in the times of the Talmud and earlier and a little bit later, people were illiterate, weren't able to read the Amida. The Amida being the most important prayer, the rabbis instituted that the cantor should repeat the entire Amida to include those who hadn't a chance to read because they're illiterate, to enable them to fulfill their obligation. What happens now if you're in a synagogue where everyone can read? We still have to do the repetition of the Amida. So Maimonides was asked this question. And this is how he answered. Question. What is the law with regard to a group of people who are largely proficient in prayer? Should the Chazan repeat the Amida so as not to embarrass those who aren't proficient, as per the original edict? Or perhaps he should not, so as to refrain from uttering a blessing in vain. After all, most people already discharge their obligation during the silent Amida. Or perhaps the congregants shouldn't pray at all on their own and leave it to the Chazan instead, so as not to do away with the established sacred tradition. The question we just asked, should he say it or should he skip it? They're all proficient. Answer. Maimonides answers as follows. Inasmuch as our sages instituted that the Chazan should repeat the Amida for those who are not proficient, the Chazan's repetition is certainly not a blessing in vain. Even if there aren't any people in the crowd who did not already discharge their obligation, the Chazan should still repeat the Amida. And then he goes a step further. This is how we ought to look at any rabbinic edict enacted for whatever reason. The edict is not in place only for as long as the reason still stands. Rather, the edict is now in force forever in the event that the reason comes up. This means that we ought to follow the edict regardless, for if not, the sage's words would be limited in context. We would then be compelled to look in each synagogue for a person who is not proficient in the prayer, so the Chazan can then repeat the Amida for him. Such behavior is obviously not what an edict is all about. The rabbis, the sages instituted this edict of the repetition of the Amida. Maimonides is making it clear that it's a wide-ranging, forever canonized mode of conduct. It is there forever, regardless if the original reasoning still stands, because we never know if it may come up or not, and therefore we have to implement it across the board unequivocally in all areas. And we have that same concept in many areas of laws, many laws throughout the Torah that we do till today. What does this teach us? The takeaway from this is very obvious. Rules fall apart when they are inconsistent. If we want it to stand, if we want it to hold water, if we want it to be something which will have an effect on us and those around us, on what we want it to be, it has to be a rule which has no exceptions. It has to be a rule which is unequivocal. Take, for example, a moral judgment that we make about others. If we make that moral judgment about others selectively, then it holds no water. And it's not a true moral judgment. Obviously, we're not judging a person, judging an idea, judging a concept, or judging someone for their flaws, whatever it may be. If we judge someone for these flaws, but for the same flaws, we don't judge someone else. Or more importantly, if we judge other people for these flaws, but ourselves we don't judge. And we have every excuse in the book, and we have exceptions lined up for why. What does that say about your moral values? Not much. It's a line in the sand. It's not a red line. If we make a commitment to do something, and we want to make sure it gets done, it's got to be clear, it's got to be unequivocal, and it's got to be across the board. Here's a quote from the Talmud, which teaches us exactly what that means about holding up principles unequivocally. Sorry, not from the Talmud, from the Midrash. Said Rabbi Ami, when the Jewish people are described as stubborn, People normally understand this as a criticism, but in fact, it is a compliment. It is due to our stubbornness that we have been willing to be killed for our Judaism. It's due to our stubbornness, in other words, that we are here today. Stubbornness can be a terrible thing, but stubbornness can also be something which is wonderful, a beautiful character trait. Being stubborn about something that we've decided, about a moral decision, about a decision, about a resolution, being stubborn about it, come what may, is what will enable us to go forward. What's an example of a decision that we have to accept it across board? Because if not, it falls what we're doing right now. Here's a quote from the Jewish law associated with that. One should have a set time to learn Torah. A set time to learn Torah should not be altered even to allow for a large increase in revenue. What is he saying here? We discussed this at length last year, if you recall, in the Torah portion of Vaera. Or was it this year? No, I believe it was last year. We have to study Torah. As Rabbi Akiva, the famous sage in the Talmud, said, that a Jew without Torah is like fish without water. And he said that statement in response to an occurrence that happened with the Roman government at the time, who issued an edict that anyone caught studying Torah will be killed immediately. A number of days later, Rabbi Akiva's student was walking and he encountered Rabbi Akiva, who was studying Torah. And he said, Rabbi Akiva, you're studying Torah. How could you study Torah? If you get caught, you'll be killed. And so Rabbi Akiva responded with a metaphor. He said that there was once a fox, supposed to be a sly animal, walking along the riverbank, and he sees a bunch of fish congregating wildly at the edge of the water. And he stops them and he talks to them and he says, fish, what's going on? Why are you congregating at the edge of the water? They responded, the fish responded, we're running away from the fishermen because maybe we'll get caught and killed. And so we're running away from them. So the fox says, I don't understand. If you want to run away from the fishermen, come out of the water. And then the fishermen won't catch you. So the fish replied to the fox, and they said, silly fox, you're supposed to be the smart one amongst the animals. If we leave the water, that's certain death. If we stay in the water, it's a 50-50 chance. Maybe the fishermen will get us, maybe not. And so Rabbi Akiva turned to his student and he said, if we study Torah, it's a 50-50 chance. Maybe we'll be caught by the Romans and killed, maybe we won't be. But if we don't study Torah, that's certain death for us as Jews. And so for studying Torah, says the Code of Jewish Law, it's not just the concept, I will study Torah. We have to make set times daily for the study of Torah. And those set times, not just that I'm going to study Torah for 15 minutes a day. I'm going to study Torah daily from 9 a.m. to 9:15 a.m. I'm going to study Torah weekly from Tuesday nights from 7:30 to 8:30 p.m. Those times, the times that we set aside for studying Torah, are unchangeable. They're firm, even if we have a tremendous business deal. And so we can go ahead and stop the Torah. We'll do the Torah study. You know why? Why do those times have to be unequivocal? Because if not, it starts breaking. Because first we find one reason to go against it. Then we find another reason to go against it. If we want this to hold water, if we want it to be something which will be firm in our lives, it's important in our lives, it has to be unequivocal. It has to be unchangeable. In the words of the previous Rebbe, this concept. There are things that people do only because everyone does them, right? Read the news, drink coffee. For example, certain cultural norms are conventionally considered proper and are then crystallized into unalterable laws. We must watch the news many times daily. It's an unalterable law. Such unreasonable habits ought to be transformed through one's own endeavors. Instead of remaining below reason, they should be elevated above reason. Business commitments, for example, pressing as they may be, do not generally overrule the times that convention prescribes for eating and sleeping. They do, alas, sometimes set aside or even cancel the fixed times that should be regularly scheduled for Torah study and prayer. A man who feels accountable to his soul should ask himself, is there any wisdom in such conduct? For who is the man who knows when his time will come? What the previous Rebbe here is lamenting is this idea that people don't have set times for what's really important in life. our commitment, our relationship with the Almighty, our prayers, our study of Torah. Are those times unchangeable as our breakfast, lunch, and dinner and our sleep times are? Are those times flexible? Or how about watching the news being flexible and those times being unchanged? How about other things being flexible and these times being unequivocal? Because if we want something to have an effect, we want something to be a part of who we are, we need to implement them unequivocally across the board. And that's the message that we can take from this story of the first three plagues, according to the Ibn Ezra, that even the three plagues were even affected the Jewish people. That because this was something of such great importance, the effect that it had to have on the Egyptians, that they should now know the true one God, it had to be unequivocal, it had to be unchanging. And so it had to affect even the Jews at that. And so it is in our lives. If there's something that we want to have an effect with, something that we want it to be a part of who we are, it's something that we know is of great importance, then it has to be unequivocal, unchanging, unflexible. It's who we are. And it has to stay that way across the board. Thank you all for joining.